Welcome to Follow Me to the MROP, a podcast dedicated to the journey of the masculine soul and the transformative power of initiation. My name is Brian Mueller. I live in suburban Dayton, Ohio, and I made my rites at Pilgrim Park in Illinois in 2014. I'm your host, and in each episode of our show, I'll sit down with one man who has made his rites, and I'll invite him to tell his story. This won't be an abstract explanation or a theological lecture, just a real conversation about what it was like to cross that threshold at the rites and what changed afterward. Before we begin, a quick word of gratitude. This podcast is brought to you by Choosing Presence. We believe that the greatest gift a man can give his community is his own presence. In a world of constant distraction, Choosing Presence provides the tools to help you stay grounded in the now. If you'd like an easy way to begin learning about the practice of presence, you can download the free Practicing Presence app at choosingpresence.org/app. Now, the Men's Rites of Passage, or MROP, is an experience designed to help men move from the first half of life into the second, shifting from a focus on ego and achievement to a life of meaning and soul. On this show, we just don't talk about the rites in theory, we talk to the men who have walked the path. Today, we are joined by a man who has made his rites, and we're going to hear exactly what that journey looked like for him. My guest today is Dave Kraybill. Brother, I'm really glad you're here. Thanks for making the time and for being willing to share your story.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm honored that you've asked me to do this, to tell my story.
Thank you, Dave. Tell us where you're from and how you spend your time these days.
Okay. I grew up, Brian, on a farm in a Mennonite home, a Mennonite farming, largely a Mennonite farming community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And eventually, after quite a number of career turns, ended up going into academia. I'm a agricultural economist by training, and so worked in the U.S. in several academic jobs at several universities. And then also along the way, my wife and I have lived and worked in Africa for 11 years. And the way I spend my time these days is I've been retired for a number of years now, and I'm a hobby woodworker. I love to make furniture, both for our house as well as increasingly for various Illuman events. And also, I put a good deal of time into some leadership roles in Illuman now.
Now let's dive in and talk about the Men's Rites of Passage. The MROP is a unique experience. It's not a retreat or a workshop. It's an initiation. Many men arrive at the rites at a crossroads in their lives, looking for something they can't quite name. Before we dive into the why and the how, let's start at the very beginning. Dave, when and where did you make your rites?
I did my MROP in 2024 at Aravaipa Canyon in Arizona.
And who was the weaver, and about how many men would you say were there?
The weaver was a wonderful man by the name of Giovanni Perez. And if I recall, Brian, I think there were about 32 men there. You were also there. You and I met there, which I will always remember. And fortunately, our paths have crossed numerous times since then.
Absolutely. I have a wonderful memory of you helping me set up the group photo at the end of the MROP.
And Brian, I do want to add that I had the opportunity to return to Aravaipa last week, in fact, for a whole week for another Illumin retreat. And in fact, I slept in a tent there this time, and I pitched my tent on the same spot where that huge temporary tent was set up for the MROP in 2024.
Oh, so right where the sacred space was.
Exactly.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. I always say, too, that Aravaipa is sort of like a mecca for men in Illumin. Those that have been there really hold that place special to them and want to make a pilgrimage there.
It is indeed a very special place. And when I went back this time, honestly, I can say I felt like I was going home.
So when you think back to the weekend of your MROP, what's the first image that comes forth for you?
Wow. It's hard to choose one. There are so many. Well, I think perhaps the strongest memory I have, image that I have actually, is helping to perform one of the rituals. It was in the second night of the retreat. The first day, we had been told that they were looking for 8 volunteers for a ritual the next day. And it was a ritual that I won't go into detail about. It was a ritual that had to do with grief. And I had gone to the MROP feeling like I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't have a lot of anxiety about it, but I just had no idea what my level of comfort was. But I did go with the commitment that I was going to be all in. So when they called for volunteers, I raised my hand right away. And I think the single strongest memory that I have from my MROP was that I've been a lifelong doer and achiever for good and for ill. And so when we had practice that first evening for the ritual that we were going to do the next day, and immediately my performance anxiety started coming to the surface. And the two trainers said something that is now written on my heart, and that is, they said, "Brothers, what you're doing here, what you will be doing here tomorrow is not performance, it's prayer." And that's become a theme of my life throughout that whole MROP. So so this memory of looking at my presence and what I was doing in the MROP, not only in that ritual, but the whole 5 days, looking at that as prayer was just really profound. And I can say at this point in my life that, that performance anxiety, that need essentially, I guess, to impress, which frankly I don't like, but it's there and it always pops up. When that comes up, I just begin to think what I'm doing of as prayer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, thinking back to the weekend as a whole, how would you characterize the experience generally?
Well, I think one of the things that was really important to me is I had spent certainly my most of my work life pretty much living in my head. And yet I also had strong spiritual inclinations, often didn't act on them in any way other than my head. Though through the years, I did have numerous experiences of what you might call intimations of God, but, really not a lot of emphasis on experience. And in the MROP, it's very experience focused. And I think also particularly that training for the ritual that first night where we were told to think of this as prayer, somehow something deep inside me got the message, you're here to experience this. You're here to experience God. You're here to experience connection with other men and even connection to people in my life that, weren't physically present there. So I think that certainly was a huge part of my experience there of just to let myself move into what some people call a three-centered awareness that was it was very much bodily, it was also emotional, and it was also the head, but the all of it was experience oriented. And that's left a mark on me now ever since then. I would say I continue to live, on a daily basis.
So, I'd like to ask you to share maybe an experience from the rites or maybe even an encounter that you had with another man there, so long as it isn't too personal or confidential.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is we spent a day in the wilderness, which is standard in the men's rites of passage. I didn't know that in advance, but we were sent out into the desert in teams, in pairs. And so I had a partner, and we were instructed not to talk to each other. And we were walking along, and he and I silently would each point out with our walking stick something that really meant something to us. And I remember very clearly walking along, I think he had pointed out an unusual cactus, though typical for Aravaipa, the high mountain desert there in the Sonora. So then as I was walking along, I was just looking at the rock formations, which are all over the place, the various plants, the aridness, and yet the incredible contrast between things that were green and most things just being totally dry and arid. And we got to this one rock face where there was a plant growing at the top of a sort of a rock cliff. And it was right at the edge, at the top. And there was a root that was growing down. It grew down through some cracks that you could see. And you could see every now and then it had sent the side roots off into the rock. And I remember just being struck with that. And it felt in many ways to me like I was feeling when I came to Aravaipa, because I came there with a good deal of pain in my life. And to see this plant there surviving in that way, and in fact flourishing in what seemed like almost impossible circumstances. And to be able to witness that with, another person, that was just incredibly meaningful.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Now, let me take you back to the period that before you signed up for the rites. What were the circumstances in your life? What was going on in your life that informed your decision to register for the rites?
Brian, I'll try to be brief on this. I have to admit, I feel like there was so much that led up to that that I could probably talk all day, but I'll try to observe the Illuman Counsel advice of being lean of speech. Yeah, so I went into a line of work that really allowed me to live out, and again, I'd say for good and for ill, my urge to do things and to be acknowledged, to get esteem for doing things. I was in a high pressured research university, and so there was just this constant pressure to publish. And then if you publish, then you get lots of positive feedback. If you don't, then, you're just kind of a dud. And so I had gotten into a habit for many years of overworking. I had begun to treat my body as though it was a machine. I mean, I could stay up all night if I needed to prepare, a paper or something like that because I'd begun to build my sense of self around what I did, which, looking back now, I can just see that's such a false foundation. But so I was, as part of my work for the university, my wife and I lived in Africa for 6 years, and I was running a major project for my university. It was funded by the US government. We were helping to train the next generation of agricultural scientists for that country. It seemed like incredibly important work. I absolutely loved it, and I was just working myself to a frazzle. And during that time, I flew back to the US for a trip, just 4 days. So my wife stayed in Tanzania. I had a heart attack the next morning, a major heart attack the next morning in the US. Was able to communicate with my wife, and she got in a plane, and so she joined me within 24 hours. But there were a number of things that happened around that time that just really caught my attention. And one of the ones that really sticks in my mind and heart is the next day I was sitting up in bed, and one of one of our daughters and her husband showed up in the hospital room, and I was sitting up in bed actually emailing my coworkers in Tanzania and Ohio. And they came into the room and they expected there to be tubes all over me and everything else. There I was sitting up in bed, and I don't remember what they said at the time, but they seemed surprised. And so I went into cardiac rehab, and eventually, after a couple months, we went back to Tanzania for another year. But it took me years, Brian, after that experience to realize that I was building my life on a foundation that was not good for me or anybody else. It wasn't good for my family. It wasn't good for my wife. No, it probably wasn't even good for my students. And then I also recall getting feedback from my children that I really worked too much. And I really pushed back at that. I thought I had done my job. I had earned income for the family. We had a stable situation. It was just hard for me to see the flaws in what I was doing. So that led me eventually into joining a group for families where families are facing challenges. And that began to open me up. I began to read Richard Rohr. I read several of his books, including Adam's Return, From Wild Man to Wise Man, Breathing Underwater, I think, and the Universal Christ. And there was a message in Richard Rohr that really stuck with me, and I probably think about it just about every day, even now, and that is the idea that pain that is not transformed is transmitted. I never wanted to transmit my pain, and I haven't really gone into what I think caused my pain, what caused me to overwork. In a nutshell, it basically came down to I grew up in a loving family, but I was the middle kid of 7 kids, and I noticed growing up, I mean, I began to realize that often feel that despite the fact that my family was loving, the dinner table was so noisy and boisterous that I often felt like I wasn't seen and heard. And I learned that at a very young age that I could get attention by making things, and so I became a maker. And so, that wasn't the only thing, but I think that was the major thing in creating the pain that I then was transmitting to other people. And so My wife and I actually were doing some therapy after the heart attack, and I mentioned to the therapist that the pain that I was feeling felt to me like it was something deeper than ordinary therapy can deal with. I remember saying that I feel my pain in my spirit, and I didn't even quite know what I meant by spirit. But the therapist, who was very good, listened and said, "Well, she said, my husband has been working with Richard Rohr for years. And there's an organization that Richard Rohr had helped get started called Illuman. Maybe you should check it out." So I went home and looked it up in the internet, and wow, it certainly looked like it could be something that I was interested in. So I found out that there was a virtual Illuman Council that in the East Coast states, and that I could easily join. So I joined that, and then began to read about the men's rites of passage on the Illuman website. Then signed up for it. Not very much after I'd gotten that recommendation from the therapist.
Thank you so much, Dave, for your story and for really detailing that. I think for you, you have a really strong sense that it was a journey. It was a period of events and that took place over a course of, it sounds like a couple years at least, that led you to the rites. Some guys don't have sort of that understanding of their experience, but that really is wonderful. It is a journey, and obviously it's a journey after the rites. Let me ask you though, when you did decide to register for the rites, and then you told your wife, maybe your spiritual director, therapist, even your kids, how did they react to your decision?
Well, gotta say, my wife was supportive. She she has different she has a different spiritual experience than I have. It's probably not something that she would do, but she was very supportive of me doing it. The only thing I would say is even in my work, my leadership work with Aruma, I tend to overwork. And, I keep telling myself, and I tell this to Mary, my wife, Illumin is here to help us become better men. And I don't want to do my work in Illumin in a way that would harm our relationship in any way. Fortunately, I feel like we've been able to keep those things into balance. She helps me keep those things into balance. And actually, we both help to keep each other in balance, I would say. But she's been very supportive.
Aravaipa is a kind of a remote location for the men's rites of passage. So whoever comes to the rites, whether they fly in or drive in, even if you're flying, you have to take a trip from probably the Phoenix airport. And then even when you come off the main road, it's another half hour, 45 minutes to get back to where the ranch is, where the rites are. And as you come in, there's this wonderful creek, Aravaipa Creek, that kind of forms a boundary. And so when you go across that, you really can see that as a threshold into sacred space. So I'm taking you back to that moment to ask you, when you arrived at Aravaipa and began the rites, was there something you were hoping for? Was there something you wanted to be initiated into?
I absolutely knew I wanted to new experiences, new deep spiritual experiences. I didn't know what they were. And I can say when we got to the edge of that creek and I looked across, because at the ford, it's probably, I don't know, 35 feet wide or something like that, looked across the ford, and there was Giovanni in a robe swinging, I forget what you call those things that hold incense, the swinging incense and walking towards us. I felt like I was moving into a different world. Like I said, I had grown up in a Mennonite community, which I have a lot of respect for in many, many ways, but ritual was, I should say, it was definitely not high church. And so we didn't have incense. We didn't, our ministers didn't wear different kind of garb or anything like that. So when I got there, in many, many ways, it was so different from what I'd grown up from. It was in this natural environment, the desert that looked very sort of surreal to begin with. Crossing that threshold for me, Brian, was really a deep experience. Again, it's one of those things I'll never forget. And last week at the retreat that I was at Aravaipa Canyon, we used that as a threshold again, and we crossed that creek again. So, and that was a wonderful memory for me.
You said earlier that you didn't have a lot of anxiety about the MROP or participating in the MROP, but Once you arrived there and you crossed the creek and headed towards the camp, was there anything you were fearing, or did you have anything that you were concerned about?
Well, I definitely had this sense that I was probably entering into an experience that would be sort of visceral, would be somatic in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I can't say exactly why, but I was looking forward to that, and yet also definitely had some anxiety about that, simply because it was a new kind of experience for me. I had also heard that there's drumming that goes on there, and, I grew up in an environment where rhythm was really looked down on, potentially evil, and I loved the idea of drumming, but frankly, I'd really never done it. So, I just thought, "Wow, am I gonna end up feeling either like a fool or a fish out of water?" And, it was that advice that first night to think of it as prayer that just helped me move out of that, and from then on, I can say really there was no anxiety. I just really felt engaged. I felt engaged with the process, with the others that were there, with the weaver and others that were leading it, and also with, something way beyond the divine.
Elder Rites is quite an experience. It takes place over the parts of 5 days, 4 nights that you're there. It's a kind of a journey of descent. There's lots of ritual and experiences, but eventually it does come to a close. How did you feel immediately afterwards, upon leaving Aravaipa and just completing the rites?
But one thing I knew was that I had had experiences there that I wanted to have them continue. I just really, really knew that. I was in a small group, a council there at Aravaipa, and that was not a great experience, frankly. I won't go into the details about what happened there, but we didn't cohere and we didn't meet afterwards. But I really wanted it to continue. So I remember that we were told at the end before we disbanded that it was really important to have a daily practice of some kind. And I hadn't had a daily contemplative practice. And so I started that very shortly after I got back. And also, Brian, I remember toward the end, I think probably right at the end, you talking about choosing presence or practicing presence that you've been working with, which is, really a very simple way of just sort of checking in a contemplative way every morning. I started doing that within a couple weeks after leaving Aravaipa, and I continue it to this day. And it's really, really been meaningful. And something else I would share is I had joined another men's group. Like I said, it was basically for men that have family issues. So in that group, when I got back, they wanted to know about this men's rites of passage, which I had told them in advance I was going to participate in. And so I didn't go into much detail, but, I probably talked for 2 or 3 minutes and, emphasized the deep experiences that I had had there. A friend of mine, or actually at that point, he was just a mere acquaintance because I didn't know him very well. He came to me afterwards and he said, "Tell me more about this. What is this men's rites of passage?" And he's told me numerous times since then, in that 2 or 3 minutes where I shared with this men's group, he said, "Dave," he said, "you glowed." He said, "You just glowed." He said, he really decided there must be something there and he wanted to do it. So I'd say I came back with a lot of energy. I was retired at that point, which, a lot of men aren't when they do this. And so they have to go back to work life. They may have a different experience. But for me, having my schedule fairly free, I was sure I wanted it to continue. And it has in various ways.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate what you shared on multiple levels. And I've talked to many men so far about these rites of passage, and I get a really clear picture of what many of them came away from the rites with. And among those things, which are find a community of men and participate in that community, spend more time in nature. And the third is always find and develop a contemplative practice. I think that's a real important thing. So yeah, I'm really glad that came through for you. Let me ask you about what's changed in your life in the last couple of years since making the rites? I'm thinking practically, spiritually, relationally.
Thanks for that question, Brian. Well, I would say, and this is just me reporting, the proof really has to come from what actually happens in my life, and others could tell this story more objectively than I could. But I would say I'm much more in touch with my own grief. I think I pretty much denied pain and grief in my life. I'm much more in touch with my body. I take much better care of my body in multiple ways, including my diet. I would say I have a much deeper appreciation for the full range of emotions. And in fact, there are a lot of ideas and views of the world, even some therapies that, largely encourage people to sort of treat your emotions as something that gets in the way. I no longer see it that way. I've come to see even what we might call the negative emotions, I mean, anger and fear and shame and so on, even those are portals for personal growth. Richard Rohr has this lovely saying about how there are two major teachers in our lives, great pain and great love. And so I've come to really appreciate the full range of emotions. I'd say I'm much more able to be vulnerable with other people. In fact, I welcome it. I literally find myself welcoming it. One could easily overshare, of course, but in the right setting, I find it easy to open up. And also, I'm more able to listen from the heart. I'd say, first and foremost, with my wife. This is our 50th year of marriage. So, we've managed to stay together all these years. We had a lot of good years. We had a lot of years that were where I can say for myself, looking back, I was not a very good listener. I was too busy doing my own thing. Now, when my wife and I are talking, I lay my phone down. I always make myself do it. And that's just one thing. Deep listening has to do with so much more than that. But also, able to speak from the heart. And another thing that has changed is, I had thought I was going to be spending my retirement making furniture, which I love to do. I mean, I am a maker and I love the design. I love to build. I just get, what psychologists call flow from that experience. And during the pandemic, I should say, it pretty much saved me. During the pandemic, I was building furniture while listening to audiobooks, lots of them, including Richard Rohr, a lot of others. And so something that has changed now is while I still do woodworking, I have really turned a lot more than I had even imagined I would to service, especially Illuman. I attended a second MROP, this time going back as an initiator in 2024. The same year I was initiated at Aravaipa, I returned to an MROP at Shrine Mountain, Virginia. And while I was there, a friend of mine who was attending for the first time, and I decided to start a local council. So we co-convene a biweekly in-person council that meets here in the Washington, D.C. area. Also then, last year I was asked to consider being the convener of the East Coast Collaborative. That is the Illuman's chapter that runs up and down the East Coast. This year I am the convener. Also, I'm quite involved at my church. I would say that also has been a result of my work with Illuman. I feel connected not only to nature, not only to God, but also deeply connected to other people. And service has just become very important for me.
Let me ask you, what do you suspect your wife might say if she was asked what impact the rites had on Dave?
Matthew Lyda asked my wife that one time. And she gave the same answer that I've heard her giving since then when people have asked her that. Though I think I'm only aware of her having been asked that one or two other times beside the time Matthew did. But what she always says is, well, Dave was good to begin with. But she's being generous. Because there's no doubt about it. I mean, I tended to avoid conflict. I tended to shut down. I could also be quite reactive, verbally at times. But, after a couple minutes, my tendency has always been to shut down. And one thing that I'm sure my wife would say that is a change that has occurred in me over the last couple years is I don't shut down anymore. she never shut down, to her credit. I don't shut down anymore. I think she would also say that I've become a good listener. And also, I think she would probably say that I've listened to her life story in a way, for good and for ill, that formed her personality. I think she would say that I've become a much better listener. And finally, I think she would say that I've become a much better partner as a parent with her.
Let me ask you, I don't know how much thought you gave to it before, but perhaps you have given it a lot of thought since your rites. How has your thinking around initiation, masculinity, the male journey through life been impacted by this event?
Oh, good question. I went into the MROP not knowing what this initiation, I mean, what was the initiation part of it, even though I had read the 2 books that Richard Rohr has written that pretty much describes it. I had a hard time getting my head around that. Maybe partly because I had lived in Africa for 11 years, and while I didn't actually personally witness initiation rites, I was aware that that had been very much a tradition for many years there, and in some communities, not very many, but some communities still practice. So I tended to see initiation as something that other people do under very, very different circumstances from my own. The way I've come to see it now, Brian, is we're constantly going through periods in our lives where we need initiation. I mean, last year I did the Elder Rites of Passage, and I realized I really needed to be initiated into the last phase of my life. Because when we do that, when we recognize where we are, maybe on the timeline, but also maybe in terms of the emotional and spiritual things that are happening in our lives, when we recognize that we're at a threshold and we're moving through what in Illuman and other settings is often called liminal space. That is times when things are really turned upside down and we don't know what the heck is going on and what direction to go. When we're at those points, it really, really helps a lot to acknowledge that we're going through a difficult, complicated, even painful time. And I guess the final thing I would say about that question, Brian, is that I often think these days about how my life may have been changed if I had gone through the MROP, say, in my early 20s. I was 24 when I got married, and, I'd gone through a lot of things in my teenage years, my early 20s. So much was changing so fast. And one thing that really, a memory I often have was how angry I got at the patriarchal models of families that was presented to me back then. And it wasn't just in my community, it was pretty much across our society, though my own ethnic religious subcommunity had its own variants of that. I felt really angry. I did not want to go and be, quote, the head of a home. I wanted a partnership. And I think if I had had the opportunity to go through a rites of passage, I think it would have kind of grounded me. And I think I would have been able to say something big is going on here. I would have reached out to other men. I think I would have begun to touch my pain as a man. I mean, at that point, I hadn't experienced nearly as much pain as I did when I actually did the MROP. But I would have at least, I had had some pain in my life, and I would have at least begun to understand that pain is a major part of my life. Because as I look back, I think the denial of pain, even denial of death, those are forces that really had a huge impact on me. And initiation, the kind of initiation we do in the MROP, I think really prepares us for that. So I also have to say, I think it's really difficult to do initiations, especially for young people in our society. Our society is so not oriented towards doing initiation rites for anybody, but especially for young people. Culturally, it's a huge challenge, and yet I think it's so important.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses to all of my questions. I just really have one more question, and I think you are situated uniquely to kind of maybe offer some advice. You've done a lot of intense work participating in the Men's Rites of Passage, then doing the Initiator program, and then following that up with an Elder Rites experience. And I'll note that you are, in another week, going to go back to the Elders Weave and help support that event. If a man about your age, retirement age, came to you and said, Dave, I'm thinking about doing a Men's Rites of Passage, but he also is aware that there's an Elder Rites of Passage now program, what kind of consultation would you give him? How would you help him discern whether or not to do a Men's Rites of Passage or an Elder Rites of Passage?
Well, good question. It's a hard one to answer because both of them, in my experience, are incredibly worthwhile. I think it would really depend on where the man is. If the man has the inclination, at least a modest amount of energy, has things he still wants to get done, I think my recommendation in life, whether it's a hobby or travel or whatever it is, or, wanting to enter into another relationship or something, my recommendation would be do the Men's Rites of Passage first, if you can. On the other hand, there are people that do them in the opposite order. And in the end, I don't think it matters that much. I would say this, the Men's Rites of Passage, it opens a door to going back to earlier things in your life more than the Elder Rites of Passages. And so if there are things you want to do, and also I would add, if you have some sense that there were wounds, some real wounds back there, it could have been small stuff or big stuff. It's basically what we call trauma these days, which we know does not just come from big events. It's the sort of thing that we get obsessed about that runs in our mind over and over again that maybe keeps us awake at night. If a man has, some of that pain from the past and is really the sort of modestly big stuff that he wants to do left still in his life, I'd say do the Men's Rites of Passage. On the other hand, if neither of those really apply, then I'd say do the Elder Rites of Passage. And I would say there's a fairly strong possibility that after doing the Elder Rites of Passage, you might say, wow, this was so good. I now want to go back and do the Men's Rites of Passage. The order is not all that critical.
Brother, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your vulnerability, your passion for this work and all that you've given to the Illuman community. It really is amazing. And I've learned a lot by listening to you today. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. It's a blessing to be able to talk with you. And I appreciate so much these interviews. I've listened to a number of them. And, one thing I would say is if a man is considering doing the Men's Rites of Passage, listen to these podcasts.
Thank you so much. I love you, brother, and I hope to see you soon, perhaps at Awaken this year.
That's mutual. Thank you, Brian.
For those listening who are now feeling a tug in their own soul and are curious to learn more, allow me to share a bit about the history of these rites. The Men's Rites of Passage was originally developed by Father Richard Rohr and was first offered at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico in 1996. While it was supported for many years by the Center for Action and Contemplation, since 2012, Illuman has been the steward of this work, preserving and adapting the rites for men all over the world. To learn more about the history and the theology behind this work, I highly recommend reading Adam's Return by Richard Rohr. If you are ready to make your rites, there are 4 opportunities in the United States and another in the United Kingdom in 2026. The first is in Northern California, May 13th through the 17th. The second in the United Kingdom, July 22nd through the 26th. And in Illinois, August 12th through the 16th. There's one on the East Coast in New Jersey, September 16th through the 20th. And the final one of the year is in Texas, which is in MROP and Umbrales, our Spanish language rites, September 30th through October 4th. You can find details and registration information at illuman.org/MROP or illuman.org/events. Additionally, mark your calendars for Awaken, the annual national gathering of Illuman, taking place November 5th through the 8th in New Mexico. You can find more at illuman.org/awaken. Finally, a special thank you to our sponsor, Choosing Presence. If today's conversation moved you, I encourage you to bring more intentionality into your daily life. Download the Practicing Presence app for free at choosingpresence.org/app. It's a simple but profound way to stay connected to the journey we've discussed today. Thank you for listening to Follow Me to the MROP. Until next time, brothers, stay present.